Fall camp for the Oregon Ducks right around the corner. So, what are the biggest things to watch for? What are some of the headlines we're following right now? And yes, there's just a sprinkle of new conference realignment news. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. I appreciate everybody out there who has done so already. We'll officially be back in season here at the Locked On College channel, meaning we're back to 5 days a week every week, not just some days or some weeks, rather, as we have been here over the summer. Been doing my best to bring you as much content as I can, but we will be really getting back into it. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And I wonder if BetOnline has got fun props like, is Max Torres going to continue to make regular appearances here on the show? I think the yes would probably be like minus 750 because we love the insight that he brings. Host of the Ducks Dish podcast and covering the Ducks for Sports Illustrated. Max, it is good to talk to you once again.
Glad to be back, Spencer. Been a little bit, but couldn't stay away for too long, and always ready to talk some Ducks with you, man.
Yeah, we couldn't keep you away for too long. And Oregon football won't be off the field for too much longer themselves. Fall camp, I think the unofficial start date I've heard is August 5th. It'll be sometime within the next week to 10 days or so, but we will have guys back on the practice field, popping pads, throwing the ball around. All that good stuff is right back around the corner. So going into that with the season, just over a month away, what are kind of the biggest things that you're watching for in terms of news to come out of fall camp as it pertains to how the 2022 season or roster might look?
Yeah, I think the biggest headline that I'm going to be tracking, as well as I'm sure every Duck fan is going to be refreshing social media constantly, is going to be that quarterback battle. Whether it ends up being much of an actual battle remains to be seen, because it looks like all signs point to Bo Nix being the starter for a multitude of reasons. The continuity with Kenny Dillingham, the performance that we saw from Nix in the spring game, and just the experience that he has at the college level. Hardly any of these other guys in the room have thrown many college passes. We saw Ty Thompson in a limited sample size last year, but Nix has the snaps to back up his resume. And I think that there's a lot of guys for him to really throw the ball to, and a lot of pieces that can help him be really successful for the Ducks if he does end up winning that quarterback job. So quarterback battle has to be the biggest one at the top of the list, but I'm also going to be looking to see how the secondary progresses and performs in fall camp, particularly those cornerbacks, mainly because that's the youngest position on that side of the ball. And I've said this for a while now, since the spring. I don't say it to exude a lack of confidence in the cornerbacks. They're just a very young and albeit unproven group of guys, but so many talented guys in that room. Christian Gonzalez comes over from Colorado. Jalil Florence enrolled early out of San Diego Lincoln High School, and then his teammate, the other Jilla Tucker, who has some crazy wheels, also joined the team, as did the rest of the 2022 recruiting class, whether it be from high school ranks or the transfer portal. So I feel like watching the cornerbacks to see how they can progress, and then going to be looking for some defensive guys to break out heading into next season. I feel like those are the two that really stand out, and I'd also sprinkle in the pass rush, looking for someone to fill those shoes that Kayvon Thibodeau left. Big shoes, absolutely. But again, like we see with the cornerbacks, there's a lot of guys there that can definitely take that jump.
I don't think those are shoes you can really fill easily. That's like saying you can find a foot that fits into the shoes that Shaq buys for himself. It's like that's a pretty unique shoe to try to step into there. But I agree that's something to watch for. Is what guys are are showing up and making plays consistently on the edge? Will it be DJ Johnson? Is Mace Funa going to exclusively be an edge player, or will he play some linebacker as well? You've got Braden Swinson in there too. There are a number of guys who, you got to find a pass rush somewhere, and it's just hard to see where it's going to come from because typically interior defensive linemen, which is the strength of Oregon's D line, with Popo and Brandon Dorlus, Sam Taimani as well. That's not typically where you get pressure on the quarterback from. You can from time to time, but it's a lot harder because you don't have as many one-on-one situations since the guards and centers tend to work more together, whereas tackles can get left out on an island. But that's why it's the most important offensive line position because you have to be able to go up against elite pass rushers there. Speaking of Christian Gonzalez, a guy who I like a lot, and I think you make a good point about the secondary too, because Gonzo is, according to Pac-12 media members, preseason All Pac-12 second team, which I think is an appropriate designation for him. He's looking like a guy who might just spend 1 year in Eugene because I think his NFL draft stock has kind of picked up this offseason, and if he really shines in Eugene for Dan Lanning and the Ducks this year, I think that could be a guy who certainly has the physical tools to be an NFL caliber defensive back. But there were some other preseason all conference nominees. And I'll touch on this a little bit more next week here on the show. But no surprises on the first team there for me. Noah Sewell, TJ Bass, Alex Forsyth, and then Brandon Dorlus, who was PFF's highest graded interior defensive lineman in the Pac-12 in 2021. The Ducks have 4 guys on the second team: Byron Cardwell, Justin Flo, Camden Lewis, and Christian Gonzalez. Then the honorable mention, you've got Seven McGee on there as a return specialist, Jamal Hill and Bennett Williams, Ryan Walk, and then Popo as well. There were a couple surprises on here for me in terms of Ducks who actually were included. I think picking Byron Cardwell's preseason second team all conference is precarious because he hasn't done a lot yet. I like him a lot. Don't get me wrong. This is not an anti-Byron Cardwell rant, but just from a production standpoint, I feel like he's in a bit of a crowded position group now with the guys that Carlos Lachlan and the staff have brought in. But he's also a guy who just hasn't played a lot of football. Gonzalez has played 2 years at Colorado and been an all Pac-12 honorable mention caliber performer as he was in 2021. So that makes a little more sense. Were you surprised that Cardwell was right there?
No, I wasn't too surprised. I think maybe that's just, Pac-12 media projecting that, he got the most work out of any of the Oregon backs from a season ago, and they're expecting him to take that leap forward from freshman to sophomore because he played in all 14 games last year for Oregon, but only actually had 61 carries for a little over 400 yards and 3 touchdowns. But he did have 6.8 yards per carry, which I think is a very encouraging number. And he has a lot of reasons to exude confidence in his abilities, just the way that he carried himself as a true freshman, the way he ran the ball with a really nice mixture of power, speed, balance, patience. Those are all really good traits that you want to see in your running back. But you make a good point. Carlos Lachlan got to Oregon and he wasted no time just injecting some serious competition in that running back room. Obviously, bringing over Noah Whittington from Western Kentucky is going to be a big help for that room. And then I think a guy that kind of flew under the radar and has flown under the radar for Oregon and Oregon fans is Marquise Irving, the Minnesota running back transfer. That guy was a very highly coveted name in the transfer portal after he had, I think it was like 700 or 800 all-purpose yards for the Golden Gophers last year. And then we can't forget about the guys that were already on the roster. Sean Dollars is definitely going to try to have something to say about getting the ball this year. He's going to be, putting his best foot forward and looking to have a healthy season. So that running back room is stacked as ever. It's really a continuous theme of the rich get richer when it comes to the running back position in Eugene, because it seems like every year, almost regardless of what happens, they have dudes at that position. And I don't see it being any different in 2022.
There's one more question I want to ask you about the running back room, but first I want to tell you about Bet Online, the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, Go Mariners. NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even my personal favorite, golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. The question I want to ask you about the running back room, Max, is do you think there will be a number one guy? Because I'm with you on Bucky Irving. Like, that was a notable transfer at the time because Oregon was kind of lacking bodies in that sense. But now that we have a clear picture of who's going to be in that position group, I feel like there aren't going to be enough carries to go around. I mean, Whittington comes from an air raid offense, so maybe he will be, a little bit more of a third down pass catching or pass blocking back because he's certainly big enough to go toe to toe with a blitzing linebacker. Whereas someone like Travis Dye was not quite as adept at doing that because he's a little smaller. But Dollars, I think, has the highest ceiling maybe of any of these guys. Cardwell averaged about 7 yards a carry in 2021 as a true freshman. Irving comes over from Minnesota with a really impressive resume in his short college football career. Like, how do you see this backfield playing out?
Yeah, I think it's kind of going to be maybe more of a 1-2 punch kind of a deal, and that really is kind of what we saw last year after CJ Verdell went down, and even when he was healthy, we saw a heavy dose of CJ Verdell. He was usually the first back to get the ball out of the backfield, but then we saw Travis Dye get a heavy workload when he was at Oregon. But I feel like right now this is as open as the Oregon backfield has been in quite some time. Obviously, we have to point to the work that Byron Cardwell did as a true freshman, but even though he did get those snaps, it really wasn't that much. I think a lot of people were a little surprised to see how much Travis Dye got the ball after CJ went down because he does have a bit more of a slighter frame compared to your traditional bell cow running back. But you got to tip your cap to him. That dude just balled out every chance he got. You see that 4-touchdown performance against Washington. That was a really big performance. But as far as your question, I kind of do see this shaking out as more of a 1-2 punch, a dynamic duo of running backs, and then maybe having a third back that comes in to maybe change the pace a little bit, or maybe spell one of those guys if they need a breather. But there's so many talented guys on that roster. I didn't even mention Jordan James, the 2022 Oregon running back signee who comes over from Tennessee. I know that he was a very highly touted running back in his own right after flipping from Georgia. Definitely another big win for Carlos Loughlin there. And for Noah Whittington, just to your point about coming over from Western Kentucky, that was an air raid offense. I believe it was the best passing offense in college football last year, but he's no slouch on the ground game at all himself. 101 carries for 617 yards. That averages out to just over 6 yards a pop. And that dude runs very, very tough when he has the ball. He runs angry, I think is a good way to describe it. Certainly saw that on display for Oregon in the spring game. Definitely had that one, I think it was like a 45-yard run around the edge that I think surprised a lot of people and was very good to see. So I don't think we'll necessarily be seeing that much of a bell cow back system or a go-to back, but maybe more so of a 1-2 duo, 1-2 punch kind of a deal with that third back sprinkled in.
Yeah, and I think we could probably spend 40 minutes speculating about how those 1-2 tandems could potentially play out because you have to factor in offensive scheme and the different styles that these guys have running the football. And I mean, there's a lot to do there. We might have to do that here on an upcoming episode of the show, and we probably will. Before we get to some recruiting talk, because I know that you follow that very closely, and I want your thoughts on that. We'll talk about Micah Banuelos going to USC and kind of where Oregon goes next. But we'd be remiss, Max. We're recording this Wednesday morning, and this is Friday's episode of the show. Today is September. I wish it was September because then we'd be playing football again. But it's July 27th, and this is dropping on July 29th. And Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports, who is a very reliable college football reporter, sent out a tweet earlier today saying that the Big Ten is not closing itself off to all of the expansion talks, and that they were looking, according to, again, this is Dennis Dodd, not me saying this. I'm not speculating about like, oh, they should be interested in this. This is somebody else saying it, and I want your thoughts here, Max. That the Big Ten is looking at maybe Stanford and Cal, and then Oregon and Washington as well to bring over to the Big Ten. I don't think talks have progressed amazingly, but that's what he sent out, and we're in the reaction business. So how do you react to that?
Yeah, it's a good development if you're an Oregon fan, right? I think some people, once it kind of looked like a Big Ten invite, hopes for a Big Ten invite, were kind of fading a little bit. Maybe it shifted a little bit more to maybe we end up in the Big 12. Maybe Oregon ends up in the Big 12, but I think it was last week that those talks came to an end officially
Yep.
after I think it was 3 Zoom calls and various meetings. Pete Thamel over at ESPN had that covered really well, and that was kind of what we were able to draw from that. So now Oregon, if you're hearing this news, it's definitely got to perk your ears up a little bit because it's like, oh, so you're saying there's a chance. So I think it's definitely a positive development for Oregon as well as those other Pac-12 teams that were mentioned, with Cal and Stanford being in the Bay Area market. You obviously think that bodes well for them. They're also Stanford specifically. They're just a really well-rounded overall athletic department, kind of similar to Oregon. But I'd say, much more accomplished in terms of all the sports. I believe they're the winningest athletic department, in the entire country in terms of
Yep.
national championships, more than 100. And I think that David Shaw is probably going to get them turned around a little bit this year with some improved recruiting. But I think it's definitely good news. I think Notre Dame still holds all the leverage here, and that we're not going to see anything happen until we get a decision one way or another from Notre Dame. But certainly for Oregon, I think this is definitely good news. And hopefully, somewhat of a step in the right direction, but I wouldn't hold my breath on anything happening super soon.
Yeah, I think there's still some time before what we would see, a potential announcement in that sense. But earlier, it seemed like Oregon had been turned away by the Big Ten, and now Dennis Dodd is saying the door is open. That doesn't mean that Oregon's walking through and shaking hands and having a deal that's on the cusp of taking place, but at the very least, and we know that Phil Knight has said that he would rather Oregon end up in either the Big Ten or the SEC or the Big 12 before. I think that's what it was, but I know that the Big Ten was one of the places that Phil Knight wanted Oregon to go, and hot take here. He's got a decent amount of say within the Oregon athletics program. For those of you who did not know, but it's another thing to monitor here because the Big 12, Pac-12 conference official talks of a potential merger, they stopped a week or so ago. But then the reports coming out were saying that the Big 12 might still try and poach Pac-12 schools, right? So rather than having it be a conference merger, just like individual schools and saying, hey, what if you come over here to the Big 12? And now it seems like the Big 10 is kind of open to expansion, though their commissioner has said, we're not expanding right now, or if we were, like, he's been kind of wishy-washy on it. I think he's the vibe that I get from him has been no for now, and if we're going to, it has to be a carefully thought out, and it's not going to be some big merger. It's not going to be a hasty decision, or that they're going to really kind of think it through and say, okay, is this going to be a valuable move or something we want to do? I don't think. I think the messaging that he's given, at least the impression that I get, and I want your thoughts as well, and then we'll get to some recruiting talk here. The message that I think Warren is trying to send is we're not opposed to expansion, but we're not, actively seeking it out in a way of, in a manner that indicates they're, being aggressive about it, right? I think they're being, I think they're conservatively moving forward. That's the best way that I can put it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And another thing that kind of sticks out to me with realignment talks in general, to kind of just keep in mind here, I wouldn't be surprised if these moves take a little bit longer to ultimately come to fruition because these schools haven't officially joined yet, right? We know BYU, UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston, I believe, are the four that are
Yep.
coming to the Big 12 in the near future. And then obviously we have USC and UCLA coming over to the Big 10. But those moves haven't even happened yet. So I think from a conference perspective, sure, you want to be hungry because more schools equals more money. But at the same time, I think it would make sense to take a little bit of a step back and kind of slow things down to make sure that you add those teams, those schools, and everything kind of gets squared away. And you're kind of into a little bit of a routine. You know how this is going to focus, or how this is going to not how this is going to focus, how this is going to go. In the years to come, before you maybe start approaching and pursuing these schools a little bit more aggressively, like you mentioned. So I think that point kind of lends me to believe that some of these moves could take a little bit longer. But I think that Warren's definitely handling it well, as far as just, saying we're still open to it. So we're still going to be taking calls. But, we're going to make sure that it's the right schools for the right reasons. And, that it fits, our criteria and, our vision, which is really becoming to expand nationally, become that first national conference, really.
More schools means more money when, like, for certain schools. I think the reason the Big 12 and Pac-12 merger talks ultimately fell off is because the Big 12 didn't think adding everyone was going to bring a sufficient amount of value. Like, a new school can
Sure.
bring in more money, but that's the reason that, some schools or some programs are told no, and other schools are getting an interest. There's just a lot of factors that play into all that sort of stuff. But it's fascinating. That's the latest development. There's nothing beyond that other than what Dennis Dodd has said. You can go read the tweet for yourself, but noteworthy, and we're just trying to keep you up to date and in the loop here on the show. Let's pivot to some recruiting talk with Max Torres covering the Ducks for SI and host of the Ducks Dish podcast as well, and a regular guest here on the show. I think that should be on your resume, personally. It's just made regular appearances on Locked On Ducks. Micah Banuelos goes down to USC. I thought previously he was a 4-star offensive lineman. It looks like he's a 3, but he's still a pretty promising player who the Ducks were going after, and Oregon was in the final 3. I think it was Oregon, USC, and A&M was the other one. That sounds right. And he's going to go down to Lincoln Riley and play for the Trojans in his career. If you had to choose between Banuelos and Josh Conerly, you would have rather had Conerly, of course. But in a perfect world, Oregon would have been able to get both of these guys, because I feel like the number of bodies that they have on the offensive line right now behind the starters this year, a little bit thin in terms of promising recruits or scholarship players. There's a good number of walk-ons who are on the offensive line, but you don't really want to be banking on those sorts of players to evolve into Power 5 caliber starters. So I feel like this is a position group that in the coming weeks and months on the recruiting trail should be a high priority for Dan Lanning, Adrian Clem, and the staff. I think defensive line is there as well. We'll get to in a sec. But where do you think Oregon's at with building the offensive line for 2023?
Yeah, I think it's a slow building process right now as far as the Oregon offensive line class in 2023. Banuelos was certainly a guy that you wanted to add to that class, and I'll own up to it here. I was pretty vocal in my my reporting and kind of predicting that I thought Banuelos was going to join that Oregon class, but it's not a perfect science, and you can't win them all. So that was definitely a bummer for Oregon fans. USC obviously closed that really strong, and I think for Oregon, if you end up getting Conerly over Banuelos, that's something that you'll take happily, especially because Conerly is already on the roster, so he can make an impact sooner than Banuelos can from just a class standpoint. But I really did like Micah Banuelos as a prospect, talked to him numerous times and saw him out on the camp circuit. But as far as the rest of this class, there are still a number of really big names that the Ducks are in it for. Miles McVay, he's announcing his commitment on August 11th, and Oregon's firmly in the mix there. Got his most recent official visit. It remains to be seen if he's going to be taking any trips before that August 11th commitment date. So I think that's something that you really have to take note of, seeing that the recruiting dead period is over. So with all of these prospects now, you really have to keep an eye on where they're going or where they're maybe going to schedule trips out to in the future. But as far as other targets for Oregon, I think he's definitely up there. Logan Reichert out of Missouri as well. I think he's out of Kansas City. He goes to Raytown High School, where the Ducks found Dante Manning in the 2020 class. He's someone who's been on campus this summer as well. And then we're looking at Spencer Fano, the Timpview offensive tackle out of Provo, Utah. Both in-state programs, Utah and BYU, are heavily involved there. Talked to Fano's father, and he just really expressed the affection that they have for the Utes. So there's definitely going to be some strong competition there, but more so in the near future, I think one newer name that has popped up on the recruiting trail for Oregon is Bryce Bolton, an offensive tackle out of Palm Desert High School in Southern California. I actually talked to him a couple days ago. He's going to be back out on campus in Eugene. He camped with the Ducks in June, got that offer, and then now he's going to be making a return trip here this weekend with the Ducks. And he did tell me that his recruitment is kind of winding down. So it feels like with him that Oregon could very much be the school to beat there. A little bit more of an under recruited player, only a handful of other offers. You're seeing Hawaii as one of them. What was another one? Colorado was another one that's also in the mix there. But with Benuelos off to USC, I think Bolton, when I was talking to him, he was saying that he kind of projects himself playing more of the interior role, whether that be a guard or a center position at the next level. So I think he's someone that you definitely want to keep an eye on. And then the last name I'm going to throw out there, we also have Samson Okunlola, but I think a lot of people know that, that is the elite of the elite, and he's all the way in Massachusetts. So it's not going to be an easy recruiting job at all there. But the Ducks did do themselves a favor by getting him on campus for an unofficial visit back in the spring. But the last name I'm going to talk about is Alani Noah, the interior offensive lineman out of Grant Union in Sacramento. He was also on campus for a visit in Eugene right before the dead period started. So that's late June. Going to be a guy that I want to have my eye on and hopefully talk to kind of see where things stand in his recruitment. But I know that he's another guy that Oregon is pursuing pretty heavily here along the offensive line in 2023.
Last thing on the recruiting trail today, Max, that I want to discuss with you is the defensive line, because I think that those are the two position groups that need to be recruited most heavily here in the coming months for Dan Lanning and the rest of this staff, not just from balancing out the recruiting class standpoint, but also with the way the roster is looking ahead of 2023. You might need to have some freshmen on there who are able to make an impact. And I think on the defensive line, Oregon's going after a number of big-time targets, but it can be tough to land those guys when you're competing with the Alabamas, Georgias, Ohio States, Texas A&Ms of the world. David Hicks, a guy we've talked about here, the top defensive lineman in the class of 2023, Mateo Uiagalelei, Samuel Mpemba, those are all names that Oregon is after. I think of those 3 5-stars, you're not going to get multiple. That's not realistic, but I would like to see Oregon get at least one after Jaden Wayne went down to Miami to play for Coach Cristobal down there. I think, frankly, they kind of need to have one, because that's what elite defenses are built on, are great defensive lines. And if you're a head coach who just won a national championship as a defensive coordinator and the defense was the driving force of that, I think it's reasonable for us as Duck fans to say, you got to be able to bring in some big-time recruits here. And I think one of Mpemba, Uiagalelei, or Hicks, I think they got to be a Duck for the class of 2023, or I think you left a little something on the table, at least on the defensive line.
Yeah, those are definitely some of the big names that you want to focus on from an Oregon perspective here in the 2023 class, especially with Jaden Wayne off the board to Miami. Now that he's transferring over to IMG, he'll be playing his college ball in the state where he'll be playing his high school football in the same state he'll be playing his college football. Excuse me. But yeah, Samuel Mpemba, Mateo, definitely some huge prospects for the Ducks. Mateo doesn't look like he's any closer to a decision. I think there's a handful of official visits that he wants to take in the fall, namely, I believe, Alabama and Clemson, once those games get going again. So he's someone that I know the Oregon staff is still pursuing very closely. And then you also have Colton Vasek. He's an edge out of Austin Westlake. And I think he's probably getting closer to a decision, is kind of what the signs are pointing to right now, saying recently on social media very soon, as far as a commitment coming. Oregon got him on campus, and I figure they have a lot of good history in the Lone Star State. But Texas looks like it's the biggest competition for the Ducks in that recruitment. Just a couple other guys that you want to keep your eye on. Blake Purchase out of Cherry Creek in Colorado. He's a big time edge guy that I know the Ducks like a lot. That one looked like it was kind of shaping up to be an Iowa State Oregon battle, but just the other day, Notre Dame entered the picture with a scholarship offer. I think they have the top class in the country right now, or certainly top two, top three. Marcus Freeman just has the Irish firing on all cylinders there. Another guy to keep an eye on, Jaden Moore out of Central Valley Christian in California. He's going to be taking a visit to Oregon this weekend. He recently announced. But David Hicks is another one that's obviously someone that the Ducks would love to add to this class. But as far as the near future, I think Terrence Green probably has to be the biggest name on your radar right now. He was originally going to
Monday, right?
announce his commitment decision coming July, or no, sorry, not July 30th. August 1st is that new date. Oregon's firmly in the mix there, and he's a guy that I feel really good about as far as where Oregon stands there. And then I think Michael Gardner is another one you have to keep an eye on from Liberty out in Peoria, Arizona. He's been a frequent visitor for Oregon. I know that he's been pretty high on the Ducks for a while now. So even though the Ducks haven't, gotten a ton of guys there on the defensive line or in the front seven, there are some pieces in the fold with Tavita Pomey, the defensive lineman out of Utah, and then Tatum Tuioti, the local guy out of Sheldon, son of Coach Tony Tuioti. So they have some pieces there, but I think if you're looking at this just from an optics standpoint, with Tosh LaPointe and Dan Lanning kind of forming that dynamic duo, it's looking like they could be landing their first big fish very soon when it comes to recruiting targets. And I think that is probably the most powerful, most star-studded, highly regarded recruiting duo on this Oregon staff. So it's kind of been surprising, I think, with all the momentum that they've gotten on the offensive side of the ball when it's such a defensive heavy staff with those names like those that I just mentioned. But I think that, you got to be patient sometimes in the recruiting game. And maybe if they get Terrence Green, that could be the start of a little bit of a domino effect that a lot of fans have been waiting to see since Dante Moore announced his commitment to Oregon.
Plenty of information. I think that's enough for one episode, and we appreciate, as always, Max Torres. He covers the Ducks for Sports Illustrated. He hosts the Ducks Dish podcast, and he is a frequent guest here on Locked On Ducks, all three equally, what's the word I'm looking for? Potent additions to a resume, of course. They're all equivalent there. Good to talk to you, Max.
Appreciate you having me on, Spencer. Thank you.
Appreciate everybody listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.